welcome to the 2014 European Day for Border Guards. My name is Paweł Świeboda. I run Demos Europa, a think tank based in Warsaw. As you can see from the name, I represent the indigenous population. Judging by the weather outside, you might be forgiven for thinking that this is the southern external frontier of the European Union, that we might be in Italy sitting at a football stadium, but in fact we are just about 100 kilometers from Europe's eastern frontier, as you know very well. Well, how many of you have been to the European Day for Border Guards before? Can you raise your hands? Right. So we have about a half of us have already participated in these discussions before, and the other half starts this experience. Well, let me remind us in a nutshell what European Day for Border Guards is about. I mean, first of all, it is about work, about sharing experience and best practices. We'll have quite a few hours devoted to that. But secondly, it is a token of recognition for the enormous service that you are doing to Europe, to Europe's integration, to Europe's values over the course of the year. And as a member of the civil society, let me pay enormous respect to your enormous service to Europe. Well, I consider myself to be a bit of a veteran observer of Frontex, the External Border Management Agency, which is our host today. And I've seen Frontex going through a pioneering phase, through the phase of growth, and then into the phase of consolidation. And as you are very well aware of, we are bidding farewell today to the Frontex Executive Director, Ilkka Laitinen. Let us waste no second in thanking him for his wonderful contribution to building Frontex and making it into an anchor of European border management. Thanks very much, Ilkka. Now, being a veteran observer of Frontex also means that I have seen the nature of the European frontiers evolve. To unveil a bit of a secret, I was behind Poland's drive to have the seat of Frontex. And at the time, in early 2000s, we considered the potential risks coming from Eastern Europe to be enormous. This is why this country sought the seat of Frontex in the first place. But the nature of the external frontier has changed. And to take us through how it has evolved, we have invited Professor Ruben Zaiotti, who is Director of the EU Centre of Excellence and Professor of Political Science at the Dalhousie University in Halifax, who will take us through last few years of developments and tell us what is the nature of Europe's external frontier today. Ruben, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. And if for those of you who might not be aware, Halifax is not the UK version, but the Canadian one. So I'm coming from Canada. Which, you know, before I start talking about today's topic, I just wanted to briefly mention about the fact that I'm a political scientist by training, so I'm not a practitioner, but I've been a keen observer of what has been going on regarding border control in Europe. I grew up in Europe, but I've been in North America for quite some time. So I think having this closer engagement with border controls, but also having an outside look, I think sometimes is useful. So hopefully what I can bring to the discussion today is my double hat. One hand, somebody who is more of an academic, but also on the other hand, somebody who's been a bit outside Europe. We tend to, you know, have discussions and debates that are more internal without necessarily taking into consideration what other people might think outside Europe. Having said that, the last thing I wanted to mention is that I'm glad to be in Warsaw again. Last time I was here, though, it was 20 years ago. So many things have changed, and certainly the first time I came to Warsaw, I didn't think that not only would become eventually part of the Poland part of the Schengen regime, but also that it would host one of the the key EU agencies dealing with border controls. So without much further ado, I wanted to get into the topic of today, which is the evolution of European frontiers. Now, when I was given the topic to discuss today, I thought, well, that's impossible. I can't do that. I have 25 minutes. How can I ever be able to discuss the evolution of border controls in Europe? So when I started thinking about how to present this topic to this audience in particular, most of you are practitioners, I tried to think about, to get inspiration from somebody who has been, who's not only was very knowledgeable of frontiers, but somebody who's been actively engaged in making frontiers in the past. What I have in mind here, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but is Lord Curzon, the British politician who was instrumental in drawing some of the most famous frontiers around the world, in particular in South Asia. Now, if you look at his quote from last century, when he referring to the evolution of European frontiers, he's talking about frontiers in general, he says something like that. The evolution of frontiers is perhaps an art rather than a science, so plastic and malleable are its forms and manifestations. So in a sense, what he's trying to say is that thinking about the evolution of frontiers over time is a complex matter. I'm sure you're aware of that. But in order to understand how frontiers evolve, it's not possible to use some kind of scientific approach. You need some creativity. You need to think a bit outside the box. So in light of that, I wanted to think about how frontiers evolve, but more particularly, I'm interested in the dynamics that drive the change and the evolution of frontiers. I don't want to go over the key milestones in the evolution of frontiers, above all in the last 30 years, because you're all familiar with that, in particular with the evolution of the Schengen regime. So in the next 20 minutes, what I'd like to do is emphasize those dynamics. What are the driving force behind the evolution of frontiers? And in doing that, I will make this argument, which I phrased around the idea of the Schengen Paradox. What do I mean by that? First of all, my starting point is to highlight certain characteristics, or I would say even elements that define Schengen as a policy regime. And I take inspiration again from Curzon when he talks about manifestations and the idea that frontiers are almost living entities and evolve over time. So I've highlighted 4 elements that I think are crucial in defining the Schengen border control regime. And I've listed them here. The fact that it's balanced, flexible, elastic, and opaque. And I'll explain in the next few minutes what I mean by that. But what do I mean by paradox? The idea that I have in mind, and generally speaking, these characteristics are considered to be in a positive light. It are those elements, characteristics of the Schengen regime that allowed it to become what it is today, a success story of European integration. But if we look more closely at these characteristics, they're not just assets, there are also liabilities. So at the same time, and this is where the paradox is, these components, these features of the Schengen regime are what makes it what it is today, but what could be in the long run can represent a challenge to its viability. And so towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to be thinking about sort of where the regime might be going in light of this internal tension. And I'll make the argument this internal tension between positive and negative aspects, the assets and liabilities that characterize the evolution of the Schengen regime are what is what represents the engine of the regime itself. But before I do that, I wanted to, sorry, I think I went too fast. Yeah. Before I do that, however, I wanted to talk briefly about the idea of Schengen as a success story of European integration. You often hear about this idea that is presented by those who are in European Union, policymakers, but those who generally have a positive view of this regime, this policy regime. I don't need to tell you about what these components, why Schengen is considered to be a success story of European integration. Of course, a freedom of movement, people can travel freely, but I wanted to provide a different perspective, and the perspective of somebody who is outside Europe, observing what's going on. One way in which we can assess the success of the Schengen regime is to look at popular culture. You might not be aware of the fact that outside Europe, Schengen has a particular connotation. And one of the ways in which Schengen is known outside Europe is through, from the fact that it has become some kind of item in popular culture. Recently, I went to Taiwan as part of a relationship our center in Canada has with the Taiwanese equivalent, and I came across a travel agency that was publicizing tours to Europe. And so in a video that this travel agency has produced, there was a description of different major stops in the tour that Taiwanese tourists would have covered. And you have the usual suspect: Paris, France, Paris, Rome, Madrid. But then you have also Schengen. Schengen, we're aware of that, it's a small village in Luxembourg. And I was a bit surprised, well, how come you include Schengen? Well, because of the Schengen regime. It has become sort of this ideal way of thinking about what Europe is all about. And that's why Schengen itself, the town, has become one of the stops in the sort of the new version of the European tour. But this idea of Schengen becoming a part of popular culture doesn't stop at the tourist dimension. Another example I've provided here on the right-hand side, this is the brochure for a restaurant in St. Petersburg named Schengen, again in Russian of all places. And apparently, according to the managers of this restaurant, Schengen tastes good. So definitely you can see a positive spin in the idea of Schengen. And the same can be said for the third image, the left-hand side. I don't know if you can see it, but this is an image of a hotel named Schengen, and you might not guess where this hotel is, but it's in Beijing, in China. So generally, whenever management has to choose the name of a hotel, you go for something that has some kind of positive, cosmopolitan meaning. Well, in this case, apparently Schengen seems to provide that aura. And then the last example I wanted to provide is about music. The picture here is a French singer who's singing a song about Schengen. The reason why this is interesting is because apparently there's another singer with the same name who's Spanish, who sings a song with the same name, with Schengen. So Schengen has definitely become a popular theme across the world. So, having said that, that doesn't mean that the Schengen regime is not going through difficult times. You're well aware of that, of this particular situation. And here I just hint at two of the major challenges that the Schengen regime is going through nowadays. One has to do with with Lampedusa, with the very highly publicized capsized boats and the number of migrants coming from the south. This is, of course, not the only route where migrants are coming, but definitely from a public relations perspective is one of the major challenges that the Schengen regime as a whole is facing nowadays. And the same could be said when we talk about the internal dynamics, what's going on within the regime nowadays. Recently, in February, there has been a referendum in Switzerland, and that has capped the number of EU migrants that are allowed to go into the country. That, of course, has implications for the agreement that Switzerland has with the other Schengen countries. And of course, until the situation is solved, that creates some tensions within the regime itself. So I just wanted to highlight these 2 points to say that on one hand, Schengen can be considered a success story of European integration, but it still faces some important challenges. Now, going back to the issues that the key components of the Schengen regime that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. Starting with balance. What I mean by the balance that characterizes the Schengen regime is the balance between freedom and security. Again, when we look at the official discourse about behind the Schengen regime, there is this idea that the regime should maintain some kind of balance between providing more freedom, in particular freedom of movement of citizens, European citizens, but also those who have a visa who are allowed to be in a Schengen zone, but also security. Probably most of you think about this as a given, this attempt to strike a balance between the two opposite elements. But that's not necessarily the case. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I'm based in North America, and the big issue in the relationship between Canada and the US has to do with the border. And if you look at the policies of above all, the American administration in the last 15 years or so, certainly this idea of balancing freedom and security hasn't been that central. Or at least the idea is that security is first, and then possibly we can talk about some freedom and facilitation of border movements. In Europe, that's not the case. I mean, there's an explicit attempt to find this balance. But of course, this is a challenging task. On one hand, certainly this balance is a moving target. At a certain particular historical moment, the attempt to create greater freedom is much more emphasized than in other times when security is more important, more crucial. And finding that balance, though, for those who are involved, both at the decision-making level, but also at the level of practitioners, is certainly difficult. And what makes it particularly difficult is that these two issues are not necessarily complementary. Of course, they are presented as such, but they're not. This is not necessarily the case. I mean, this is particularly the case when we talk about security. The idea is that in abstract, if you can provide more security, then you can protect freedom. But security is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy to a certain extent. The more security you provide, the more security that seems to be required. And it's as I said at the beginning, it's a moving target. And what that means is that there's inherent tension here in striking this balance between freedom and security. That's what characterizes, in my view, the Schengen regime. The second characteristic that I want to emphasize is the flexibility. For those of you who have been working on Schengen might be familiar with the term. It's a legal term that is used not just within Schengen, but in the European integration discourse. It has to do with the institutional framework within which this policy regime is inscribed. The fact is, as you well know, the Schengen regime was created outside the European Union, and then even when it was integrated into sort of the EU architectural institutional framework, there were some exceptions, some so-called opt-ins, opt-outs given to some countries, in particular the United Kingdom. The idea is that an entity that is flexible has the capacity to bend without breaking. That's the core principle behind flexibility in the case of European integration. Of course, Schengen is one of the best example of how this idea has been put to the test. and generally speaking, that is presented as a success story. Flexibility has allowed the European integration process to go forward. If the approach that was taken back in the 1980s and 90s was that of either everybody is on board or we're not going further, probably we would not have Schengen, we would not have Frontex nowadays. So in that sense, it was necessary. It was a necessary strategy that had to be used in order to get to today. But having said that, when you create exceptions and try to construct an entity institutionally that has so many exceptions, then there are potential problems. And the main problem is certainly that of coherence. Because once you start having certain countries that are in and out, some countries that have some opt-ins in certain areas, not in others, the overall outcome could be a structure, institutional structure that is very complex and it's very difficult to manage. And that over time can be disruptive. And in fact, speaking to some of those who were involved in the creation of Schengen in very few years and the very early stages of this policy regime, one quote that sort of resonated in my mind is that the idea that Schengen could have become the graveyard of European integration, not the sort of the success story we're talking about today. So this is another internal tension that I think is quite evident in the Schengen, in the evolution of the Schengen policy regime. The other, sorry, no, I missed one. Sorry about that. Balance. It's not working. The other issue is about opacity. And what do I mean by opacity? This opacity, again, using this metaphor about the sort of materials, as if Schengen was a living entity, an object. Opacity is the property of this entity of transmitting light. Now, in the case of a Schengen regime, often it has been presented as a project, an institutional entity that lacks transparency. And this, on one hand, it could be considered a negative aspect. But at the same time, if you think about the way in which the regime has come to life, first of all, as I mentioned before, outside the European Union, but also as an intergovernmental type of experiment in which discussions were taken in sort of behind closed doors, without much engagement with civil society. I'm talking about in particular in the early phases. To a certain extent, there have been a lot of efforts made in the last few years to open up this policy regime. But overall, it's been like a technocratic, top-down type of approach. This, though, going back to the idea of whether it would have been possible to have an open discussion at very early stages of this project, probably not. If you were sitting down around a table back in the mid-80s or 90s and trying to figure out a way to open up border controls, national border controls in Europe, it would have been probably impossible to persuade everybody at all different levels. At that time, even ministries of interior were quite skeptical about the idea of abolishing borders. And also the population at large. Certainly there was not a debate about it. But that allowed for those who were involved in the process to go ahead and discuss and also agree on the criteria that made possible to actually abolish national borders and create sort of external borders around Europe. Now, having said that, the fact that there hasn't been an open discussion about what it means to have common borders, shared frontiers, has some important consequences. One of which is that the sort of one topic that you probably heard of a lot about is the lack of accountability and the democratic deficit that characterizes European project as a whole. And certainly these are, it's becoming more prominent in recent years. But there also are some implications about how you create legitimacy for a system that is at least on paper, based on the idea that we have now in Europe shared frontiers. If you think about the national frontiers, the idea that behind that is that there's some kind of shared identity among those who are part of the entity that is included within those borders. At the moment, I don't think we have had this discussion about shared external European frontiers. If you talk to the population at large, they might certainly enjoy the fact that they can travel freely across Europe, but I'm not sure they really are attached to the idea that now we have shared frontiers. And that, of course, has implications for the question of trust among the various European states and its citizens and their citizens whenever we talk about frontiers. The last point that I want to mention is that of elasticity. Again, another property here for materials and other entities is the idea that these materials can expand without breaking. In the context that I'm referring to, in the Schengen context, is that of enlargement. The idea that this policy project started from the very beginning with, it started with a sort of small amount of countries, and European countries, South European Union. But the idea was from the very beginning that it would expand and include other members of the European Union and possibly other European countries. And certainly this was and still is one of the main assets of Schengen, the idea that it's not a closed system. Those who meet the criteria, they're European countries, although this what European actually means, it's open to debate, but certainly if they meet certain criteria, they can become part of this family of countries that share borders but do not control common borders, only the external ones. And this has created certainly support and legitimacy for the project. These are the positive aspects of this elastic dimension of the Schengen regime. But of course, you can see also some of the negative consequences of this elasticity. And you can see clearly in the debate that is ongoing nowadays about the expansion of the regime to new EU members such as Romania and Bulgaria. Although they meet, at least on paper, the criteria of membership to the Schengen regime, but there are political reasons or why some countries are not happy about this prospect, and the result has been the postponement of the entry of these countries into the Schengen regime. But apart from this sort of political dimension, certainly the idea that the Schengen regime can expand indefinitely creates some potential problems for the viability of this policy regime. If you think about when it started with 5 and 6 countries, and now certainly the number has exploded to a number to include. It has become quite difficult to manage. So certainly in the long run, this idea of elasticity has to be rethought. And again, this is another example of the internal tensions that characterize the Schengen regime. Now, what does all mean? I mean, if we look at the recent events characterizing the Schengen regime, we can definitely see the results of these ongoing tensions within the system. And I put here on the slide some quotes from newspapers. They were sort of looking at recent events characterizing the Schengen regime. As you can see, they're quite gloomy. The vulnerabilities of Schengen, dividing forces are mounting in Europe. This is just about the Schengen regime. And then the beginning of the end for Europe. So, but is that really the case? Is it Schengen really going through a period of crisis that might lead to the demise of not just the Schengen regime, but Europe as a whole? Well, the argument that I'm making, if we look at the evolution of the Schengen regime over time, it's a bit more positive. At least there are some elements that should be taken into account that might give a more brighter perspective on the future. So, and certainly if we look at previous crises that the regime has gone through, we can notice resilience in light of, for example, of previous enlargements of the Schengen regime, but also crises that that the regime has faced. So, for example, in the early 1990s, when the Schengen regime became operational in the first place. Certainly, there were a lot of criticisms and delays, and that led to some commentators thinking about the prospect that maybe Schengen would not come into place in the first place. But it did. So it's certainly the Schengen regime has been resilient in the past. So if we look at these dynamics, this internal tension that characterize the Schengen regime, how can we make sense of their resilience? How can the Schengen regime hang all together? Now, in my experience in discussing with policymakers involved in the making of this regime, something that stood out is the idea of the Schengen regime as a pragmatic enterprise. What I mean by that is not the sort of the sense of the term that is generally presented is quite negative. So the idea that you use expediency to achieve a particular goal. So the emphasis on the means, on the goals rather than the means. Any means is good to achieve a particular goal. I don't mean that kind of pragmatism. The pragmatism that I have in mind is that taken from what the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce refers to the idea of experimentation. Pragmatism in this sense is the idea that whenever you want to solve a particular problem, in this case it's about how to achieve a common area, travel area and a common external frontier, is to experiment based on a working hypothesis about how this system might work, without necessarily having all the knowledge about how this could work in the current situation. But it's a guess about where the system might be going. And then once this hypothesis is tested, then, depending on the results, then there could be a justification for the very hypothesis that was provided in the first place. I think this idea, this experimental nature of the Schengen regime has been at the core of this experiment from this project from the very beginning. Okay, a couple of minutes, I'll be done. And that's the idea behind the concept of Schengen as a laboratory of the European Union, you might have heard in the past. So let me conclude with some thoughts about the way ahead. How can we think about the evolution of the Schengen regime in light of these tensions, but also dynamics that characterize the regime nowadays? Now, if we consider the Schengen regime as a success story, certainly there are reasons to believe that it is a success story. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the fact that this success story is based on some fragile foundations. There are some internal tensions that then, over the long run, might become unbearable for the system itself. And those who might be involved in the regime at the sort of the practical level, dealing with border control every day, might not be aware of that. This is more the sort of the political context that defines this regime, but definitely something to be kept in mind. The other issue is that the relationship between Schengen as a policy regime, as a project, and a European integration project more generally. Of course, whenever we think about the Schengen regime, we think about this as one of the pillars of the European integration process and project. But I think if we look at the history of the Schengen regime, we can look at the relationship from both ways. It's true that the Schengen regime depends on the European integration project. This is where it's coming from. This is the idea, the sort of the political drive behind the process. But I think also the European integration project needs the Schengen regime, in a sense that if it is indeed one of the most prominent examples of successful integration, without that, without having this the success story up front, then the European integration process might be open to criticisms that is not actually delivering to the promises that he made more than 50 years ago when the project was originally created. So how can we think about the Schengen regime? And so the idea is that both are mutually not only influence each other, but they have a common fate. So how can we think about the Schengen regime in the future? I think one way to think about how the Schengen regime can survive and remain a success story of integration is if it maintains this idea of being a laboratory of European integration. It's as to experiment, to be more bolder and try new ways of thinking how difficult policy areas, in this case would be border control, can be conceived beyond the national. And this is something, definitely a challenge for the Schengen regime, but what that means is that it doesn't have to sit on its laurels and think that the task can be accomplished. And with that, I'd like to stop here and thank you for your attention. And I don't know if there are any questions, but thanks a lot.